today because I'm in a position to announce the lecture of our very dear guest, Professor Ulf Brunnbauer. I'll have to say that one of the most distinguished professors and one of the most important researchers of the social history of Southeast Europe. Professor Brunnbauer is scientific director of the Leibniz Institute for Research on Eastern and Southeast Europe, and he's also a chair of the Southeast and East European History at the University of Regensburg. And during the last 3 decades, Professor Brunnbauer wrote and thought extensively on social transformation, migrations, processes of modernization and industrialization, and globalization, and also on historiography in Bulgaria, Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Greece, I mean, all Yugoslavia. There is no researcher who deals with the history of the Balkans who hasn't cooperated with Ulf Brunnbauer or read some of his important works, and I will mention his most important books. His PhD work was published in 2004, Mountain Communities in the Balkans, Economy and Family Structures in Rhodope Mountains in 19th and 20th century, Globalizing Southeastern Europe, America, Immigrants and the States since the late 19th century. He wrote together with Klaus Buchenau in 2018, History of Southeastern Europe, and his latest book, he is co-author of the book In the Storms of Transformation, 2 Shipyards Between Socialism and the EU. So I have to say that somehow, since Professor Brunnbauer received his PhD in Graz, then he worked at the Institute, East European Institute of the Freie University in Berlin, and now he is in Regensburg. He somehow united those 3 most important centers that are dealing with the history of Southeastern Europe, and besides maybe Munich in German-speaking world, and the most important centers for the history of our region. And I'm sure that we are all very excited to hear the lecture with the most eccentric title that we had in among our lectures and at our Tribune, How an Oily Fish Conquered the World and Niche, a Glocal or Lobal History of Sardine Can since the 19th century. So, Professor Brunnbauer, please.
So, thank you, Olga, for this most kind introduction. I also have to apologize that although I have been dealing now with this region and also with the territory of the former Yugoslavia for, I don't know, for 15 years, but my active Serbian or Croatian, however you want to call this language, is so bad that I'm going to speak in English. But I'm perfectly fine in, of course, receiving questions in Serbian, but don't push me to speak it because I don't want to violate this really beautiful language. When we were discussing with Olga about what topic to speak, I suggested a couple of ones. Some were sort of probably more relevant and are more important, but also more depressing. And I've been now here in Belgrade for 3 weeks already. And when you read the newspapers, listen to the news, watch TV, you get enough bad stories, enough unhappy. So I thought, let's take a time off and let's discuss something that is a little bit more exotic, more esoteric, maybe not so important, but hopefully entertaining. Although at the end, this is also, there's no happy end, unfortunately. The other day, I'm now living near Piazza Gera. I went to the piazza, and what did I find? A can of sardines, Stari Beograd. And where it is produced? In Rovinj, by the Mirena cannery. This will be the main protagonist of my story. So this is my sardines, very, very healthy, all Stari Beograd. And there will even be, but I will come to that only at the end of the talk. So don't run away if you want to know what's the part of niche in this story. There's even a small niche component, which probably very few of you and I also didn't expect when dealing with the sardine. This is what I'm going to present is kind of a little bit of a hobby. You have seen from the publications that were mentioned that I started as someone dealing with mountains in the Balkans, mountain societies in the 19th century. And I have gradually moved to maritime history. So my last book was on shipbuilding. It was the comparative history of the Uljanik shipyard in Pula and a shipyard in Poland, Gdynia, from the 1970s to basically today. So a history of social and economic transformation starting in the mid-1970s during the oil crisis and then going on until the accession to the European Union. And this is, I came across also these other maritime stories, which I often call histories from a can. And I think, I mean, we are all surrounded by these mundane consumer products, which we don't really think about it. We might consume them, but we don't really think of where they come from and what histories they actually have and represent. So we are basically often very ignorant about our immediate material surrounding, the world that makes our world as well. But everything has a history. I mean, I don't need to tell that to historians. And so also fish or a fish can also has a history. Fish can be very political. They can even trigger interstate disputes because fish has because of its nature, it has a proclivity to ignore imaginary borders in the water. The Brexit talks, for example, almost failed because the European Union and the United Kingdom could not agree over fishing rights. Fishing rights date back into the early modern period. More seriously, Iceland and the UK almost fought a war over cod in the 1960s and 1970s when Iceland began to expand its territorial waters. This dispute even reached the United Nations, the UN Security Council in the mid-1970s, and Iceland at some point threatened to leave NATO. And then the United States intervened and basically forced the UK to accept Iceland's stand. The United States was in a tuna war with Peru and Ecuador in the 1950s when Peru and Ecuador started to extend their fisheries jurisdiction. So historically, so there's a process in the 20th century of extending territorial waters. It started with 3 miles, and now the claims of exclusive economic zones go up to 200 miles. And so there was a conflict about tuna, which was a tit for tat conflict between the US and Ecuador and Peru. The sardine is a relatively small fish, as you know, but it also had its 15 minutes of political fame in California. California was, in the first half of the 20th century, one of the centers of sardine catching and also the production of sardine cans in the world. And Californian fishermen and also producers of cans began to be concerned about a decline in the stocks of sardines already in 1930. So, for example, in 1938, there was a ballot initiative in California, which suggested to introduce measures to protect sardine stocks, which actually even passed. And this is one of the first attempts actually to regulate, to restrict fishing, because for a long time, and it took basically into the after war, as a post World War II period, for a long time, most people actually thought that fish was so abundant, or sea life was so abundant, that it could not possibly be harmed by fishing. California saw even a second ballot initiative in 1948 after sardine catches had declined dramatically in California. And when the initiators of such a this ballot initiative claimed that in order to preserve sardine fishing, there needs to be more restriction in order to preserve this multi-million-dollar commercial fishing industry and its multi-million-dollar sports fishing industry. Interestingly, the opponents of this initiative claimed, I quote, these are the official documents. So California, as you know, has this system of direct democracy, and the opponent said, an initiative controlling a natural resource is basically unsound. Ocean fishery is subject to great natural changes in abundance yearly with periodical good and bad crops, even without man's interference. So that's basically the same argument climate deniers would make today, that climate changes all the time without a human interference, which of course we know is not true. So what connects these brief examples is the usability of fish for conservation. Sardines, tuna, and at that time also salmon were stuffed, are stuffed in conserves and shipped around the world. You can buy a can of sardines everywhere in the world. Cod is salted and dried and then turned into delicious dishes in places far away from where it is caught. So cod dishes are a specialty in Upper Italy, for example, but of course the fish comes from the North Sea. The exploitation and consumption of these species allows us to see how global capitalism and also how globalization works. In their book, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, Raj Patel and Jason W. Moore argue that capitalism, in its quest for cheapness, exists only through frontiers. I quote, expanding from one place to the next, transforming socio-ecological relations, producing more and more kinds of goods and services that circulate through an expanding series of exchanges. And the oceans and nature in general is one of such a frontier. The oceans have been seen by capitalism as a free gift, to quote these 2 authors again, because capitalism is happy to view the ocean as both a storage facility for the seafood we have yet to catch and a sinkhole for the detritus we produce on land. So I think we can agree that commodities, therefore, are not only congealed labor time, which is what Karl Marx said, but they also congealed nature. Now, I'm a modest historian of the Balkans, and of course, I'm always happy if my small story fits into this kind of large-scale explanations of the world and of globalization. But I'm also hesitant to quickly explain away local specificities and to paint historical developments in these very, very unicolor black and white terms. Because when we zoom in on lived experiences on the small scale, things get usually more complicated and less straightforward. Global forces themselves manifest themselves in very different ways, depending on always specific local contexts. To put it differently, local actors can modify the vectors of globalization. How depends on which resources are available to them. So this is also the case with the sardine and its industrial exploitation. True enough, this is a story of cheap labor, as we will see in a minute, of cheap nature, also in Southeastern Europe. But this is also one of development, of impoverished areas, of social advancement, of modernization, of struggles, and of local pride for a product that is healthy, affordable, and ubiquitous. The history that comes out of a sardine can speaks not only about environmental and social degradation, but also about visions of the future and about world making, about global connections. So let's hear from a foreman of the Mirena sardine factory, which produced the Stari Beograd conserva in the town of Rovinj, whom I interviewed for my small project. So just some excerpts from this interview. The problem started in the 1990s, especially from 1995 to 2000, when the dolphins appeared. As you know, because there again are dolphins in the upper Adriatic. There were so many dolphins, and dolphins eat a lot of sardines. So they so much frightened the fish, and then you can eat your own net. Then he went on. In earlier times, in the 70s and 80s, we worked a lot for Kuwait and for Iran, and we worked a great deal for the army, for military positions. we had been trained in a different system. We were more Western educated because we were sometimes before that under Venetian rule, and then we were under Austria for 180 years. This means my grandfathers, both of them, served under Franz Joseph. They made the railways, they made the harbor, and so on. So you see a lot of different stories that cannot be experiences that cannot be easily put into one narrative. Experiences of empire, of nature, of business and work intersect in multiple ways. Producing fish cans links people to the wider world, and their relevant spaces are very different from those imposed by the government. So let me try to disentangle these connections. Here's the interview. Okay, when in this audience, I don't need to tell you where Rovinj is in Istria, of course. So first things first. Sardine canneries came to the Upper Adriatic in the 1870s, when these coasts belonged to the Habsburg Empire. Some of these factories were founded by French entrepreneurs, other by Austrian businessmen coming from Trieste or also from the interior of Austro-Hungary. In the town of Rovinj, the first cannery appeared in 1882, established by a French company. Until the outbreak of World War I, it is said that 27 fish canneries were created along what today is the Slovenian and Croatian coast, the so-called golden era of the Croatian fish processing industry. Obviously, then this was actually Austrian territory. It is indicative that the sardine industry began to flourish in the Upper Adriatic when the major ports, Trieste and Fiume, were linked to Europe by railways, making the transportation to Vienna, Prague, Budapest, and so on, to the most important markets, much cheaper and faster. These canneries were often and quite for a long time the only industrial enterprises in these places that used to be really very poor until the advent of mass tourism. So today, difficult to imagine, but Dalmatia was the poorest province of Austria. They provided paid jobs and created new connections with the world because production depended on supplies from somewhere else. And the markets of these products were also somewhere else, sometimes quite far away. The important role of French entrepreneurs is no coincidence. It was a Frenchman, Nicolas Appert, who in 1795 invented the modern preservation of food by sterilization and hermetically sealing sterilized food in a container. First he used glass and then tin. The first canneries of fish also appeared in France. A certain Joseph Collin established the first ever sardine cannery in Nantes, Bretagne, almost in the Bretagne, in 1822. That's a model of the city of Nantes in the museum, the historical museum of Nantes. And here you see this modest factory, which had to close pretty soon because the neighbors were so disgusted by the stench coming out of this factory. By around 1880, France had 160 factories for canned sardines, employing thousands of workers and securing a livelihood for thousands of fishermen. The boom in the Bretagne did not last long, although, because sardines disappeared before the Bretagne in its waters in the 1880s. Nobody exactly knows why. This was the reason why then French entrepreneurs moved to northern Spain and then also to Portugal, helping to turn Portugal into the leading producer and also exporter of canned sardines in the world. It is still today one of the most important producers. In the Upper Adriatic, aside from French businesses, the role of Austrian capital was crucial, which is, of course, quite logical because these regions belonged to Austria. A particularly interesting case was Karl Wachanek from Vienna. He was born in Bohemia in 1829. He received his training at the Polytechnic School in Vienna. And then after traveling a lot in Europe as a salesman, he came across fish canning in Marseille. And this he took as an inspiration to open his own cannery, the first one in the vicinity of Trieste. And then he established a couple of canneries along the Dalmatian coast. In 1880, he even established one in Vienna, a cannery for fish, where he was appointed purveyor of the imperial court. And this factory produced canned fish into the 1990s, thanks to migrant labor. So it connects my interest in the history of migration. And if you look at the names of people who work there, many of them obviously come from Yugoslavia. And what is also evident, except of this guy who was probably a boss, all the others are women. And this is already the second law of sardine canning. The first law is, of course, you need sardines, obviously. And the second one is the workforce almost everywhere and almost is predominantly female. Karl Marx had made clear that commodities are products of class relations. A can of sardine is a case in point. Work in a fish cannery was and still is hard and poorly paid. Workers faced noise and an unsavory stench. It was also pretty dangerous sometimes. Work was often seasonal initially, at least before deep freezing of fish was invented. Thus, pay was irregular, so that workers had to find alternatives during the period of no fish landings or dependent on the wages of their family members. So for this reason, it was often marginalized labor that filled the shop floor of a cannery, be it in California, in British Columbia, in Canada, France, Portugal, Germany, Morocco, Istria, or elsewhere. So this also means that the structure of the cannery shop floor gives you a fair picture of the patterns of marginalization and inequality prevalent in a society at the specific historical moment. Unsurprisingly, for example, Californian canneries depended on cheap immigrant labor in this very racialized hierarchy of labor in the US. In fish canneries, these were often initially Chinese until they were excluded from coming to the US. Then later Japanese and Italian until they were during World War II excluded from the economy, and later Mexican workers, very often women. In Europe, it is almost exclusively women who filled the cannery shop floor at the time when there were very few, if any, other paid jobs available for them in these regions along the coastline. Their pay was subsistence, made possible by the fact that their families either did some farming or their men earned a living as a fisherman. So it was indeed an industry that was based on cheap labor. In the history of Rovinj, the case study I explored, the sardine cannery, so some pictures from fish canneries around the world, and it's really very, very conspicuous that the shop floor you see only women here, maybe one or the other supervisor or technician who is a man, but those people doing the real hard work are all women. Even in countries like Morocco, where female employment is certainly not the norm in the 1950s. The predominance of female labor in the cannery in Rovinj, but also elsewhere in Yugoslavia, continued during the socialist period. In the 1950s, for example, more than 80% of the employees of the Mirena cannery in Rovinj were women, most of them classified as filetti. That is, they were responsible for cleaning and filleting the fish. There's only a little bit of archival documentation. I mean, that's one of the problems if you do the history of small business in general, but especially in places like in former socialist countries, very little of these company archives have survived. So it's a very sketchy, only a very sketchy heritage that has come upon us. But there are some interesting documents on Mirena. For example, I came across the report of a sanitation inspection in 1955, which revealed that, I quote from this report, the majority of female workers did not cut their nails and had dirty fingernails. And to which the director of Mirena responded by pointing out that long fingernails helped in cleaning the fish. So there's a pattern, but family resemblance does not mean sameness. In a collaborative project with an ethnologist in Ljubljana, Tanja Petrovic, whom certainly many of you know, was involved, we interviewed former and present workers, female workers of fish canneries in today's Slovenia and Croatia. Most of them spoke in a quite nostalgic tone about work in the cannery and about their work-based community under Yugoslav socialism. Some of them had come from the country's interior and found work, so from really very marginalized places, and found work in a cannery, a liberating experience from the patriarchal families that they had left. But how come that such an apparently unpleasant work is remembered so fondly? Because I think we can exclude the possibility that fish offal smelled better under communism. Cleaning the fish, putting it into cans, piling the cans, all this was hard manual work also in a socialist factory. But it is apparently the way how socialism managed such low-skilled, humble jobs that made its shop floor so different from capitalist ones. Unskilled workers received a lot of recognition and felt acknowledged as a valuable part of society. In the Yugoslav context, self-management, as we know, neither led to workers' democracy or workers' control or factory democracy, but it helped to build affective, emotional communities around the workplace. Factories provided ample social welfare and opportunities for diverse activities, and the cannery in Rovinj, which grew into quite big business, made no exception. A photo album from the Mirena factory from the 1970s is full of pictures of working women, and many photos depict celebrations and training or other community events, indicating the crucial function of the enterprise in creating a shop floor community. Of course, a few pictures don't tell a social history, so we should not read too much into them, but I think they're still quite telling also in the way how confident these people look. With the exception of the Miss Sardelle, that was on the annual anniversary of the factory, there was an event where also the Miss Sardelle was elected, and her very sort of dubious privilege was to have the first dance with the director of the factory, which was one of the very few men working there. So the directors were always male throughout the history of this factory. So it seems that at least in the Yugoslav context, cannery work in places like Rovinj, as said, which were pretty marginalized, pretty poor, and until modernization came under socialism, and especially until mass tourism. Now, cannery work was also one of economic and social advancement. I don't know enough about other European contexts, starting to research them, but for example, in the case of Portugal, it's really quite conspicuous that at least the visual representation of fish canning in the 1930s and 40s, so under the regime of Salazar, semi-fascist dictatorship, looks really very similar. Salazar, by the way, when he was Minister of Finance, so before he was turned into dictator, long-term dictator, as a Minister of Finance, he also was really very enthusiastic supporter of sardine canning, because sardine cans was the most important export product of Portugal in the 1930s. And there's a wonderful book in different languages, Portuguese, of course, but also German and French and English, The Golden Book of Portuguese Tinned Fish, Lisbon, 1938. And if you look at the pictures, could be from a socialist country in the 1950s, doesn't look so different. You have these modern facilities, modern housing, childcare, smiling workers. There are pictures with female engineers. So a very similar visual representation, highlighting that these small factories were an important part of modernization in the countryside. And incidentally, this was also a form of industrialization that was tightly embedded in existing local resource extraction patterns, linking fishing, oil making, so olive oil making, and vegetable production. And this might also help to explain its resilience. Resilience is the last topic I want to briefly highlight. The Mirena factory in Rovinj will soon celebrate its 100th anniversary, actually this year, which I think not many enterprises or factories in Southeastern Europe can actually claim, because few of them survive so long. the Uljunik shipyard that I studied in my book was established in 1856. And during our research, it went bankrupt. I hope it was not related. It was not caused by our research. And then one of the guys in Mirena told me, you know, in contrast to ships, there will always be a demand for fish. And he's right. So surviving so long is quite a feat. And you have to ask why, especially in a region that has experienced so much political turmoil. Istria, as you know, has changed hands several times in the 20th century, from Austria to Italy, brief German occupation at the end of World War II, then Allied control, then of course contestation between Italy and Yugoslavia, finally most of it going to Yugoslavia, also Rovinj, and now independent Croatia. That's enough this political discontinuity that can ruin your business, especially if it is not only borders that change, but also ideologies and the ways the economy is organized radically is transformed. And one could add actually 2013, when Croatia joined the European Union, which really meant a dramatic change in economic governance, which very many Croatian businesses, like for example, Uljunik shipyard, did not actually understand, because they thought that they could always depend on the government to help them in times of crisis. And the Uljunik shipyard basically always made a loss. But under the European Union, this is not possible. So that's accession to the European Union is really a caesura. In our book on the shipyards, we basically say that with accession to EU, post-socialism comes to an end. But anyway, so what is the survival strategy of such a business in a politically so contested and volatile region, and how can you survive these radical changes in the political economic framework? When, for example, and it has something to do about local strategies to transcend borders. When Rovinj came to Yugoslavia after World War II, which was of course a dramatic change for Istria, not only in terms of its the political identity, but also in terms of population. There's many or most Italians leaving or being pushed out of Istria, a lot of people from other parts of Croatia and other parts of Yugoslavia moving there. So what we can see from the surviving documentation of the Mirena factory is that from the very beginning, they started to lobby the government, Croatian government, the federal government, to be able to re-establish their business links with partners, trading partners across the Iron Curtain. The Mirena factory had traditionally procured olive oil from Italy, to which of course Istria belonged until 1944, tin for the cans from Germany, and sardines, because local catches were usually not enough, from other Mediterranean countries, now all belonging to NATO. The main consumers were in Western Europe, in the United States, and Czechoslovakia, with which Yugoslavia, of course, after 1948, did not have any diplomatic relations for quite some time. And so the business documentation from this period shows systematic lobbying efforts from below towards the government in Belgrade and in Zagreb to liberalize foreign trade and to provide support for exports. So we of course, we know this story of Yugoslav policymaking starting to liberalize foreign trade, so the state monopoly on foreign trade being disbanded, and then also in the late 1950s embarking on the strategy of export-led modernization. We know this story from sort of the point of view of economic policymakers and the economic theory, but we don't know the story from below. So because these were also responses to pressures from below by those businesses who were supported to export, but they also told the government, okay, guys, we can do that only if you allow us to trade, also with countries with which we have political disagreements. When socialist Yugoslavia finally embarked on an export-led development strategy in the late 1950s, the Rovinj cannery had a very strong argument to ask for government subsidies, because most of their products went to hard currency countries. So Yugoslavia was integrated into the International Division of Labor not only by exporting workers, but also by exporting sardines and also ships, of course. It became a real mantra if you look also in the local So there's a wonderful regional newspaper, Glass Easterday, and they're so proud of their export-oriented industry, although very often actually these factories didn't make any profits because it was such a complicated and convoluted system of exchange rates that they ultimately depended on money coming from the government. During the 1970s and 1980s, some more pictures. During the 1970s, 60s and 70s, Mirena built a real empire of fish. It acquired its own fishing fleet. It bought a small shipyard for repairs. It produced its own tin for the cans, also its own packaging. It had its own shipping business, its own printing press, and so on. And this, in a way, also exemplifies some strategies of Yugoslav businesses at the time when vertical integration and insourcing was the common strategy. So not what nowadays any sort of business textbook would tell you, you should outsource, you should focus on your core business and do only what you can do best, but don't do everything. But in a socialist economy where supply was always problematic because suppliers were unreliable, it was better to do as much on your own as possible. Mirena was one of the first enterprises worldwide to farm sea bass and gilthead. So most of the sea bass, all of the Croatian sea bass that you can get today is farmed, or you pay 5 times as much for a kilo. I mean, also like in Pula, you pay 40 euros for a kilo of wild sea bass and maybe 10 or less for farmed sea bass. And they were proud to export to more than 50 countries across the world, from America to Australia. They did quite well even in the 1980s because, of course, the Yugoslav economy did not do so well in the 1980s, but the Sardine canneries, at least, they profited from record catches at that time of sardines in the Adriatic. Nobody exactly knows why, but the 1980s were very good for fishermen and then also for businesses that depended on this fish. They also survived, which is even more astonishing, privatization in the 1990s. I mean, a very similar story to this country, probably. Crony privatization. Also, the Mirena factory was bought by one of these very dubious Croatian businessmen, of course, linked to Franjo Tudjman, one of these capitalists without capital, and he almost, when he then was also charged and went into jail for some other fraud, but he almost ran the factory all in the ground until it was bought by Podravka, this major Croatian food conglomerate. Well, you all know Vegeta, for example, which is produced by Podravka and which enjoys the privilege of being a so-called strategically vital business in Croatia, and therefore also has some government support. So, industrialization had come to Croatia in the 19th century, mainly in the form of food processing. And this appears to be one of the country's few viable industries also today. The other big coastal industries, I already mentioned, shipbuilding is disappearing. Uljanik closed 4 years ago, Tribina as well, and this year, actually last week, also Brodosplit declared bankruptcy. So all the 3 big Croatian shipyards now standing still. Food radiates also a sense of locality and authenticity that can add a dose of extra resilience in the face of global market pressures. This is where the French, of course, excel, praising the value of terroir also when they sell their sardines. As the Mirena people say, a quote from a brochure from the late 1980s, the Adriatic sardine is of special delicacy and extraordinary flavor. It is much better than those from the oceans. It is the basis for, as they now advertise their fish, the super hrana is Jadrana, which is the current slogan of Mirena. Okay, let me come to a brief conclusion. In Monterey, California, I think I do have a picture somewhere. No. In Monterey, California, which is 100 miles south of San Francisco, a and which used to be the sardine capital of the world in the 1940s, Canary Row today exists only as a touristic attraction, which has, as per its website, memorable experiences for the history buff, the shopping enthusiast, the food fanatic, and nature lover. Canary Row's memory is kept alive also by John Steinbeck's immortal novel of the same name, Canary Row. So that's a book about a sardine cannery town. A very good, excellent book, actually, with also a second sort of follow-up, Sweet Thursday. There's a wonderful book about Monterey, which is now this kind of very touristic American seaside town, of course, without any industry, but with a memory of industry. It's really sort of commercialized. And there's an excellent book about this history by Connie M. Chang, who showcases how class and ethnicity shaped the struggle over the coastline. Who can control the coastline? Who can use the resources of the coastline? Tourism or the fishing business? Ultimately, it was tourism for various reasons, also because, of course, of the class nature of tourism, at least in that area when it was the upper class that visited Monterey, and which did not want their summer vacation being ruined by the stench coming out of sardines. But there was also natural reasons, because for reasons that we don't know exactly, sardines disappeared from the Californian coast by the end of the 1940s. This led to the collapse of what was the most important sardine processing industry in the world. Today, there's no cannery anymore on North American soil. The last one in the US closed. No, there's one in New Brunswick. The last one in the US closed in 2010. And the American cannery business moved south, where the sardine and where cheap labor is, like Peru, for example. Mirena and a few other Croatian, now we soon come to niche. Mirena and a few other Croatian sardine canneries, I think it is in total 4 nowadays, that still operate, might find their days counted as well. First, they face growing difficulties to recruit workers for a production that cannot be fully automatized. The salaries are still very low and much lower than what you can earn in tourism, which of course is the major industry along the coast. Most local people own at least one property, also thanks to socialism, actually. And so why to toil in a factory when you can also rent out or Airbnb your flat? When the Mirena factory a couple of years ago bought new machinery and introduced the second shift, they could not recruit local workers. Nobody was ready to work for the wages they could offer. So they recruited workers from the depressed parts of Croatia, Eastern Slavonia, and from Bosnia. So much also for there's no immigration in Croatia. The other strategy is to move the business there where the cheap labor is. And now finally niche comes in. Yeah, because in 2006, actually 5, it was decided, the owners of the Neptune Paprika in Komiša on the island of Vis, as you might know, it's pretty near Split, very much to the east. Very nice place, of course. They decided to close down, also because of local pressure, because of course this is also one of the places that 100% focused on tourism, and you don't need such an industry. So they closed, which was the oldest sardine cannery in the Adriatic, and they sold their machinery to a businessman from Niš, who then set up the Interfish sardine cannery in a village near Niš, which also went bankrupt in the meantime. And so you have this, then at that time, this nice headlines, Niš le prodajo sardini Hrvatskoj. But indeed in Pula, but there's still a small fleet, 3, I think, boats that catch sardines. And you could see in the morning when they land, these lorries with refrigerators from niche, registration plate niche, waiting for the sardines and bringing them to niche to be produced, which tells you something about the importance of cheapness of labor. But maybe today labor is not cheap enough anymore in niche. I don't know. Another possibility how to survive is, because I mean, there's a lot of price pressure, is to upscale, which is what the Portuguese do. The Portuguese the French are also very successful. Now you have in every French city, you have this really nice shop where you can buy pretty expensive fish cans, very often sardines, upscale, I don't know, sometimes with special ingredients, and of course very nicely presented. It looks really very different from what Mirena does, but they count on, of course, the super grana is Yatran. So upscaling, and this can cost like 7-8 euros a can. Upscaling is one possible response to price pressures, because European canneries cannot possibly compete, for example, with Moroccan producers. Morocco is now probably the leading producer of sardine cans worldwide, first of all because they're sardines, but mainly because labor costs are much lower, and Morocco can export to the EU tariff-free. So there's this question of cheap labor, but there's even more serious, and this is why in most places along the Adriatic, sardine canneries have disappeared, sometimes at least leaving a memory of them, like for example Banijol. It's very evocative, but of course aesthetically a bit nicer, the one on Pastira, which also used to be an important sardine canning producing place, but not anymore. But there's an even more substantial threat, and this is why this story probably doesn't, if you're interested actually in our work, you can know where's my map. There's an even more substantial threat to this industry in the Adriatic, and this is why there's no happy end to this story, which has, as I tried to show, proved to be really very resilient during the 20th century, despite all the many economic and political challenges this region has faced. And this threat is connected to climate change and rising seawater temperature. So because of its biological characteristics, small pelagic fish, so fish that lives in the outside of the coastline water, after coastal waters, and that moves a lot, small pelagic fish, such as sardine, anchovy, and also herring, which represent a quarter of all fish catches worldwide, so it's really significant. They are highly sensitive to environmental forces, and they are extremely variable in their abundance. Sardines can reproduce, can spawn only in a very, very narrow range of water temperature and of salinity levels. So now the Adriatic has a very specific, very particular system of current. There's one current on the east coast from the south, which brings warmer and higher salinity water from the Ionian Sea. And there's one going along the Italian coast from the north, which brings cooler and also less saline water downwards because of the big rivers, especially the Po that enter into the Adriatic in the north. And the sardines, they need these currents, and they can sort of spawn, reproduce only in between. This is where the right conditions exist for them. Because of climate change, the system is now changing rapidly. Seawater, the Adriatic belongs to those seas. I mean, it's a small sea, it's more like a lake, where water temperatures rise fastest among all the seas and oceans of this world, which is also why it serves like a laboratory of what will happen to maritime fauna and flora because of climate change. Things are moving quicker, faster there, but it's of course something that will happen in other places as well. And as a result, the sardine might, or most likely, will disappear from the Adriatic, and most likely also from the whole Mediterranean, and will be replaced by tropical and subtropical species which enjoy warmer water, where sardines become increasingly abundant in the North Sea. So today, sardines are caught north of the British island, which was just not imaginable 40 years ago. And which also might mean that at least post-Brexit Britain might have a chance in establishing a sardine cannery business. Okay, so much from my side. If you want to read more on that, we have produced a book from this project that I mentioned with the colleagues in Slovenia, in Slovenian and also in Croatian, Priče konzerve, which is based on this ethnographic and small local history that we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brunbauer, for this really inspiring lecture on the way how production of sardines actually globalized and included this region in processes of globalization, and for that hint how sardines changed our cuisines, and also how distribution of sardines changed maybe in a way our identities through the way how our cuisine changed and so on. However, the main focus was on the process of production and exchange of work. And I would like to invite our colleagues now for the questions and comments on your very interesting lecture. So please. Well, maybe it was because the lecture, yes, Dmitar Tasic, our colleague. Mm-hmm. Evo, ako ćeš.
Just a small observation. Did you happen to cover the practical war between Italy and socialist Yugoslavia over the illegal fishing? Because it was very prominent at that time. You know, there were many ships were Italian, especially not Yugoslav, were illegally fishing in Yugoslav waters. Did you happen to cover that part of the story?
No, I mean, I don't know much more than you obviously do, so that there was illegal fishing. I was not so much into, I'm still not, so far not really so much interested in fishing per se, but really only in the production, the processing of fish. But that would actually be quite an interesting story. I mean, it's also quite interesting how Yugoslav fishing industry was established in the first place, because most of the fishermen, at least in Istria, were Italian, so they left, most of them. Then you have in the late 1940s in the documentation, there was ministry for quite some time in the 40s for maritime industries in Zagreb. You have these complaints about Italian ways of fishing, not in regard not so much to contemporary, so illegal fishing, but to overfishing during fascism. So fascism became also associated with unsustainable fishing, to the extent there's a logic behind, because Italians used different nets that came from Sicily, which you can fish much more than what traditionally was used in this place. But definitely, yeah, there's a sort of a politicization of fishing, and it would be certainly interesting to look into this question of illegal fishing and how this was also negotiated between these two countries. And this is something, the interesting so dimension of this story is very often that you have, of course, you have the government level, but then you have, I mean, local actors who very often do things in contradicting what the government actually wants them to do. So that would be quite interesting. And of course, it's in a way a continuous story now, not between Italy and Croatia, but between Slovenia and Croatia. And yeah, very silly dispute over territorial waters, when what they do when they don't send their navies, which they don't have anyway, but they send like fishing boats, sort of violating what the other country considers its fishing rights, so that the maritime police of the other country has to intervene, which gives these bad pictures, of course.
You have.
So I wish to congratulate, and it's really a fascinating topic and fascinating lecture. One thing just puzzled me. You mentioned at the very beginning it was an olive oil, and it was olive oil coming from Italy. And what I recall from my childhood is that it has always been this industrial refined oil used in this sardine cannery stuff. So when this transition, sunflower, yes, when this transition actually happened, and from where I suppose that this might integrate in some way much broader areas of Yugoslavia in connection with this sunflower oil. So when it happened, and whether they ever tried again to use the olive oil as in this this fashionable way. Rio Mare, is it Rio Mare stuff? But I never find it in the Croatian or the Yugoslav terms of production.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't exactly know where the sunflower oil comes from, but obviously from those parts of Yugoslavia where sunflower oil was sunflowers were grown, which is not Istria, of course. But traditionally, olive oil was in this region used to be relatively cheap, abundant, and it was, of course, it was not this kind of high-class extra virgin oil that we now so cherish. It was traditionally used, and then with the expansion of production in the 1950s, they started to use other oils that are less tasty. One reason is that I mean they're most important. There's certainly a difference between what they produced for the export markets and what they produced for the domestic market. Because anyway, Yugoslavs were not big fish eaters when they are still not came out of them today. So the consumption of fish per head was very low in Yugoslavia, also in the interwar period, and you all know, I mean, basically, like the fish eating zone in Croatia ends 50 meters after the coastline. So the main domestic consumer was the army, and obviously for army provisions you don't need high class.
I recall that
olive
as well.
Olive oil. And this is probably where many of you who had the privilege to serve came across sardines. So there's a certainly difference in that. I mean, lately they're trying to produce more higher quality sardines, and then you can also find some with olive oil. I mean, also the quality of the sunflower, I think, improved over the time you recollect.
Thank you.
Concerning distribution through these decades of socialist Yugoslavia, do you have some numbers that are showing what percentage of cans were sent abroad and what percentage was distributed on Yugoslav territories?
It was the overwhelming majority. We're speaking of 70–80% of production went abroad, and most of it to Western countries. Of course, also the idea was to earn hard currency. So it was definitely predominantly export oriented. The whole business model was predicated on that, also in the way how they formulated, how they framed their requests for investment money from the city, from the Republican government, because they're always highlighting, okay, we are producing mainly breakfast, so we belong to this showcase, importantly in the industry that helped to earn foreign currency. That was always the majority, by far.
Are there any other questions, or maybe we should finish our sorry.
Sorry, my English is not so good, but
Da srpskom može, slobodno.
da li ste istraživali kad ste pomenuli da ovu fabriku za konzerviranje ribe u Nišu, ne znam da li ste znali da je svojevremeno Jugoslavija, odnosno Srbija, bila značajan izvoznik kavijara. Ta fabrika se nalazila u Kladovu i radila je do izgradnje hidrocentrale Đerdap. Možda tu možete da nađete neku, pa niste znali. Da, to je takozvani kladovski kavijar. Da. Pa tu možete možda da istražite nešto, da nađete. Ne, ne postoji zato što riba od koje je dobijan kavijar zbog hidroelektrane više ne može da se mrezi. Ali je decenijama to bila značajna fabrika.
Hvala.
I hope and I'm sure that this presentation was really unique and it will inspire some future research for our colleagues. And I want to thank you very much in the name of our institute and our colleagues for this really fascinating lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.